Haiti earthquake. Haiti was devastated by a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on January 12, 2010, which resulted in widespread devastation from the earthquake. In close proximity to Port-au-Prince, the nation's capital, the epicenter was located. It is believed that between 220,000 and 316,000 people lost their lives as a consequence of the earthquake, while over 300,000 people were wounded and more than 1.5 million people were left homeless. The damage was made worse by the low quality of the building and infrastructure. Despite the fact that the world community reacted with help, recovery efforts were hampered by a number of factors, including corruption, logistical obstacles, and an epidemic of cholera. Haiti continues to struggle with rebuilding and restoring normality even 10 years after the earthquake that occurred there. Cyclone Bola. On November 13, 1970, Cyclone Bola made landfall in sections of India and East Pakistan, which is now known as Bangladesh. There were storm surges that reached heights of 10 meters in certain regions, and winds that reached up to 185 kilometers per hour were brought about by it. It is believed that between 300,000 and 500,000 people lost their lives as a result of the disaster, which wiped out whole villages. In the aftermath, those who survived were subjected to starvation and sickness. Inadequate action taken by the Pakistani government in reaction to the accident stoked political dissatisfaction, which ultimately played a role in the Bangladesh Liberation War and the subsequent independence of Bangladesh in 1971. Naples Plague. The plague that struck Naples in 1656 was one of the most devastating outbreaks of the bubonic plague in Europe. It was responsible for the deaths of almost 300,000 individuals in the Kingdom of Naples. Every day, hundreds of people were losing their lives. Poor cleanliness, housing circumstances that were overcrowded, and a lack of awareness about medical procedures all contributed to the fast development of the illness. The economic situation was very precarious as a result of the cessation of commerce and the decrease in agricultural yield. Despite the fact that it took decades for the city to recover, the incident continues to serve as a vivid reminder of the destruction that infectious illnesses inflicted in the pre-modern society. Rwanda genocide. The genocide that took place in Rwanda took place over the course of just 100 days, from April to July of 1994. A total of between 800,000 and 1 million persons, the most of whom were of Tutsi ethnicity, were murdered during this time period. Inciting violence via propaganda and utilizing radio broadcasts to urge assaults was a tactic that Hutu extremists used. Clubs, machetes, and rifles were the principal types of weaponry that were used. Women were subjected to pervasive sexual violence, and not just children but also women were affected by this. Although there were strong indications that widespread violence was about to occur, the international community did not act in a significant way. The genocide was finally put to an end when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was commanded by Tutsis, toppled the government. However, the genocide left Rwanda with severe scars and faced enormous obstacles in terms of rehabilitation and reconciliation. The Korean War. There were an estimated 1.2 million to 3 million persons who lost their lives as a result of the Korean War, which took place between 1950 and 1953. This number includes both troops and civilians. North Korea's invasion of South Korea, which was sponsored by China and the Soviet Union, was the first spark that ignited the war. The United Governments of America, together with other governments that are members of the United Nations, took action to provide assistance to South Korea. Heavy bombardment, furious warfare, and broad damage of towns and villages were all hallmarks of the conflict that took place. Many civilians were caught in the crossfire, and many of them were forced to flee their houses. Following the conclusion of the war in 1953, an armistice agreement was reached, which resulted in the division of the Korean Peninsula along the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ. Both the destruction and the loss of life had long-lasting effects on the area, and tensions between North and South Korea continue to exist to this day. The Iranian Famine. The Iranian famine that occurred between 1917 and 1919 resulted in the deaths of around 2 million individuals, which at the time represented between 20 and 25% of the country's total population. A combination of factors, including the disruptions caused by World War I, bad government, and severe drought, led to the outbreak of the famine. As a result of the presence of invading British and Russian forces, the situation became much more severe. These forces requisitioned food supplies exclusively for their soldiers, allowing Iranian citizens to starve to death. Diseases such as cholera and typhus spread swiftly among the populace that was already in a weaker state. The famine continues to be one of the most terrible but less well-known catastrophes in Iran's history. It had a long-lasting influence on the demography and economics of the nation. The Bengal famine. During the Bengal famine of 1943, which occurred in the Bengal area of British India, an estimated 2 to 3 million people lost their lives. This famine is considered to be one of the worst in modern history. A number of causes contributed to the famine, including the policies that were implemented during the war, agricultural failures, and the stockpiling of food by merchants. Indifference and incompetence were two of the most common criticisms leveled against the actions of the British colonial administration, which was led by Winston Churchill. In the course of World War II, millions of Indians perished from starvation as a result of food being sent outside to help the British military effort. Families in their whole were forced to resort to begging on the streets, and a significant number of them became victims of famine or illnesses, such as cholera and malaria. As a symbol of colonial exploitation and poor administration, the famine continues to be remembered. The Vietnam War. It is estimated that between 1.3 and 4.3 million individuals, including troops and civilians, lost their lives during the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1955 to 1975. This war was a horrific struggle that caused those fatalities. The Communist North Vietnam, which was supported by China and the Soviet Union, and South Vietnam, which was supported by the United States, were the two sides that fought throughout the war. During the war, there were bloody fighting, massive bombings, and the deployment of chemical weapons like as Agent Orange, which had long-term impacts on people's health. As a result of the conflict, whole towns were destroyed, and people were forced to relocate. The majority of the victims were civilians. Despite the fact that the war came to an end with the fall of Saigon in 1975, its legacy continues to have an impact on both Vietnam and the United States. World War I. In the course of World War I, sometimes referred to as the Great War, which took place between 1914 and 1918, it is believed that between 15 and 20 million people lost their lives. The struggle was fought by major nations, who were split into two groups: the Central Nations, which were headed by Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the Allies, which were led by Britain, France, and Russia. As a result of the introduction of new combat methods, like as trench warfare, chemical weapons, and tanks, it caused damage on a scale that had never been seen before. On the battlefield, millions of troops perished in appalling circumstances, while civilians suffered from bombardment, malnutrition, and infections. Additionally, people were killed by diseases. The Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919, brought an end to the war and imposed severe reparations on Germany. It also provided the framework for the development of World War II. Indian Ocean Tsunami of 2004. A natural catastrophe that occurred in the Indian Ocean in 2004, and was also referred to as the Boxing Day tsunami, was one of the most deadly natural disasters in the history of recorded events. This large underwater earthquake, which had a magnitude of 9.1 to 9.3 and occurred on December 26, 2004, occurred off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia. Coastal areas in 14 different countries, including Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and Indonesia, were catastrophically affected by the tsunamis that resulted. There were about 230,000 fatalities, and millions more people were wounded or forced to flee their homes. The survivors were forced to contend with the devastation of their homes, infrastructure, and means of subsistence as whole communities were washed away. Immediately after the accident, an extraordinary international relief response was initiated, which ultimately resulted in the construction of early warning systems in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Famine of 1876-1878. During the years 1876-1878, the Indian Famine, commonly referred to as the Great Famine, claimed the lives of around 5–10 million people, in the southern and central regions of India. The outbreak of the famine was precipitated by a severe drought that was brought on by El Niño, which resulted in the loss of several crops. The practices of the British colonial government made the problem much worse, since grain shipments continued even as millions of people went hungry. There was a lack of proper relief operations, with food being offered in return for work in circumstances that were very difficult. Both the inadequacies of colonial authority and the disastrous consequences of economic policies that valued profit above human lives were brought to light by the famine. The Japanese invasion of China. The Japanese invasion of China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937-1945, resulted in the deaths of about 10 to 25 million people, including both military personnel and civilians. This number includes both civilians and military personnel. Atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre, in which Japanese soldiers are thought to have murdered between 200,000 and 300,000 people in a span of 6 weeks, were a defining characteristic of the conflict. The bombardment of cities, the burning of villages, and the subjecting of inhabitants to mass killings, sexual assault, and forced labor were all events that took place. There is a legacy of pain and enmity between China and Japan that continues to this day, which was left behind as a result of the war, which substantially damaged China. The Bengal famine of 1770. There were around 10 million people who perished as a consequence of the Bengal famine that occurred in 1770 in the Bengal province of British India. This famine is considered to be one of the worst famines in past history. There were a number of causes that contributed to the famine, including a severe drought and exploitative economic practices that were enacted by the British East India Company. The corporation persisted in demanding taxes and money from commerce, despite the fact that harvests were failing and people were starving. Whole settlements were deserted, and those who managed to survive were forced to scavenge for food alone. Bengal's population and economy were both severely impacted by the famine, which resulted in a third of the population being lost. It is common practice to use this tragedy as an illustration of the negative impact that colonialism had on the residents of the areas it colonized. Napoleonic Wars. It is believed that between 3.5 and 6 million individuals lost their lives as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, which took place between the years 1803 and 1815. These deaths included both military soldiers and civilians. Napoleon Bonaparte, who aimed to achieve his goal of expanding French authority over Europe, was the leader of these conflicts. Major wars such as Waterloo and the invasion of Russia were among the engagements that took place. Both of these events resulted in devastating casualties owing to the hard winters, sickness, and malnutrition that occurred. Those who were not military personnel were also impacted by massive devastation, relocation, and economic suffering. The wars came to an end with Napoleon's defeat and exile, which resulted in the remaking of Europe's political landscape and led to the Congress of Vienna, which tried to restore equilibrium and avoid additional hostilities on a major scale. The Congo Free State atrocities. It is believed that between 10 and 15 million people lost their lives as a direct consequence of the crimes committed by the Congo Free State between the years 1885 and 1908. King Leopold II of Belgium, who ruled the Congo as his personal colony, was responsible for the atrocities that took place during his reign. The populace was subjected to forced labor in order to collect rubber and ivory, and workers were subjected to severe penalties like as amputations if they failed to achieve quotas. Villages were destroyed by fire, families were torn apart, and millions of people perished as a result of brutality, illness, and famine. Leopold finally gave up sovereignty of the Congo as a result of international protest, and the Congo was subsequently incorporated into Belgium as a colony. The crimes have left indelible marks on the area and are widely regarded as one of the most heinous instances of exploitation in the annals of human history. Measles. During the measles outbreak that occurred in 1529, indigenous peoples in the Americas were wiped out, and it is believed that between 6 and 8 million people perished. As a result of the introduction of Europeans, illnesses such as measles, smallpox, and influenza quickly spread across Native American populations. These diseases were transmitted by alien microorganisms, and Native Americans lacked immunity to them, The plague that was carried to the Americas by Spanish explorers in 1529 had an especially devastating impact on the Aztec Empire when it arrived. During this time period, whole settlements were destroyed, and the population of the Americas saw a significant reduction. It was because of the epidemic that indigenous people were able to lessen their opposition to European colonialism, which made it easier for the Spanish to conquer the Americas and permanently altered the demographics and cultures of the continent. The Soviet famine of 1932-1933. An estimated 5 to 7 million people perished as a result of the Soviet famine that occurred between 1932 and 1933. This famine is also referred to as the Holodomor in Ukraine. The tactics of Joseph Stalin, which included forced collectivization and food requisitions, were the cause of this famine that was caused specifically by humans. Farmers had their harvests taken away from them, and any who did not comply were faced with severe retaliation. In Ukraine, where the famine was at its worst, whole communities were deprived of food and eventually perished as a result of the confiscation of grain for export. In other instances, survivors resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and even dead bodies in order to survive them. A large number of people believed that the famine was a genocide committed against the Ukrainian people, with the intention of stifling their national identity and opposition to Soviet domination. The Tangshan earthquake. An estimated 242,000 to 655,000 persons lost their lives as a result of the Tangshan earthquake that occurred in 1976. This earthquake is regarded to be one of the worst earthquakes of the 20th century. The earthquake, which had a magnitude of 7.5, occurred on July 28th and rocked the industrial city of Tangshan, which is located in northern China. Entire neighborhoods were obliterated, and many of people discovered themselves buried under the debris. Both a lack of resources and inadequate infrastructure made it difficult to rescue those who were trapped. As a result of the destruction of water supply and sanitary infrastructure, survivors were at risk of developing diseases and malnutrition. In the beginning, the Chinese government attempted to conceal knowledge about the tragedy. But, as the city was being rebuilt, the magnitude of the disaster became more apparent. Tangshan has subsequently become a symbol of resiliency in China, and this transformation has taken place. Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was a large civil war that took place in China between the years 1850 and 1864. It is claimed that between 20 and 30 million individuals ended up losing their lives during this conflict. The uprising was headed by Hong Xiuquan, a self-proclaimed prophet who intended to topple the Qing dynasty and build a heavenly kingdom of great peace. The struggle featured enormous troops and extended sieges, and citizens suffered from famine, sickness, and massacres. Hong Xiuquan was the leader of the insurrection. Cities like as Nanjing were left in rubble, and whole areas were eliminated from their population. Despite the fact that the revolt was ultimately put down by Qing troops with support from outside sources, it also left a profound scar on China, which contributed to the decline of the Qing dynasty and ultimately led to its final collapse. Yellow River Flood. An estimated 1 to 4 million people lost their lives as a result of the Yellow River Flood that occurred in 1931, making it one of the natural catastrophes that has caused the most deaths in human history. There was a mix of factors that led to the flood, including excessive rainfall and the breakdown of dikes along the Yellow River in China that were not properly maintained. Whole communities were flooded, and those who survived were forced to flee their homes and face the threat of famine and illness. Agricultural crops and cattle were wiped off, which resulted in severe starvation. In addition to highlighting the need for improved infrastructure and disaster management, the tragedy brought to light the susceptibility of China's rural people to natural disasters. And Lushan Rebellion. It is believed that between 13 and 36 million people lost their lives during the Lushan Rebellion, which took place between the years 755 and 763. This rebellion was one of the worst battles in the history of humanity. The commander Lushan, who had proclaimed himself to be the emperor and was working for the downfall of the Tang dynasty, was the leader of the uprising. Over the course of about a decade, the struggle was responsible for extensive damage, including the starving of large numbers of people and the destruction of whole cities. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, and raiding armies succeeded in killing a significant number of them. The uprising was a turning moment in Chinese history that led to economic downfall and political fragmentation. It also undermined the Tang dynasty, which also marked a turning point in Chinese history. The Great Chinese Famine. It is projected that between 15 and 45 million people would have perished as a result of the Great Chinese Famine, which took place between the years 1959 and 1961. Mao Zedong's administration launched a program known as the Great Leap Forward with the intention of swiftly industrializing China and collectivizing agriculture. This drive ultimately led to the famine. Several policies, including the installation of community kitchens and the confiscation of harvests for use by the state, contributed to the widespread famine that occurred. The numbers for grain output were inflated by the local authorities, which led to an excessive amount of grain being requisitioned and causes food shortages. As a result of the destruction of whole communities, those who managed to survive began consuming things such as leaves, tree bark, and even human flesh. Because the Chinese government is unwilling to accept the full effects of the famine, the topic of the famine continues to be taboo in China. 1918 Spanish Flu Pandemic. The pandemic of Spanish flu that occurred in 1918, commonly referred to as the Great Influenza, is widely regarded as one of the most lethal pandemics in the history of humanity. Beginning in the latter stages of World War I and continuing until 1920, it was believed that almost one-third of the world's population was affected by the disease. Approximately 50 million people are said to have perished as a result of the disaster, with some estimates reaching as high as 100 million. As a result of worldwide troop movements that occurred during the war, the virus, which was caused by an H1N1 influenza strain, spread very quickly. As opposed to other types of influenza epidemics, the Spanish flu disproportionately impacted young individuals who were in good condition. A significant number of fatalities were attributed to pneumonia and subsequent illnesses. Hospitals and morgues were experiencing a severe lack of space, which caused whole villages to become overrun. The crisis was made worse by the paucity of medications and vaccinations, despite the fact that public health measures such as mask requirements and quarantines were enacted in several locations. The pandemic had a long-lasting influence on the healthcare systems and scientific research going on throughout the world. The Holocaust, which was carried out by Nazi Germany between the years 1941 and 1945, was one of the most methodical and industrialized. There were about 11 million people who were slaughtered, including 6 million Jews, Romani people, handicapped persons, political dissidents, and other members of minority groups. After being collected up, victims were placed in ghettos, and then they were sent to concentration and extermination camps like as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. While others perished as a result of forced labor, malnutrition, or medical experimentation, many were put to death in gas chambers before their deaths. As part of the Holocaust, Einsatzgruppen forces in Eastern Europe were responsible for committing a number of atrocities, including mass killings and other crimes. Adolf Hitler's ambition for racial purity and territorial expansion included the genocide as a major component of his agenda. The Holocaust had a significant influence on the conscience of people all over the world, which resulted in the formation of organizations that advocate for human rights and the identification of genocide as a crime that is committed on a worldwide scale. World War II, the Second World War, which began in 1939 and ended in 1945, was the worst battle in the history of humanity, with an estimated death toll of between 70 and 85 million people fighting and dying. The war was fought between the Allies, which included the United States of America, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, and the Axis powers, which included Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy as the leaders of their respective factions. Bombings, massacres, and the Holocaust were responsible for the deaths of a significant number of civilians, who made up the bulk of deceased individuals. The United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the war, which resulted in the deaths of over 200,000 people. This was the first time that nuclear weapons were used in a military conflict. The destruction of whole cities resulted in the displacement of millions of people. As a result of the struggle, The political landscape of the world was transformed, which ultimately led to the Cold War and the foundation of the United Nations in order to avoid future hostilities on a substantial scale. The Black Death. It is still considered to be one of the worst pandemics in history, the Black Death, which occurred between the years 1347 and 1351 and spread over Europe, Asia, and North Africa. It is believed that between 75 and 200 million people were slaughtered, which is equivalent to 30 to 60% of Europe's total population. The plague, which was caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, was transmitted from person to person as well as by fleas that were carried by rats. A fever, enlarged lymph nodes, buboes, and dark skin as a result of internal bleeding were among the symptoms they experienced. The abandonment of whole communities and the practice of mass burials became widespread. There were significant repercussions on both the social and economic fronts, including the reduction of feudalism, the emergence of new religious and cultural traditions, and the lack of labor. The Black Death also had a significant impact on medical research since the size of the pandemic posed a challenge to the conventional methods of treating diseases and maintaining sanitation. I know you were expecting more video like this. So, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps me bringing you more content.